07 The Drowned Mage. What we call the history of the world is usually the human history of the world. In our pride and arrogance we assume that ours is the only tale worth telling. In doing so we ignore the heritages of the elves, the minotaurs, the merfolk, and yes, even the goblins. Who knows what kingdoms rose and fell among the merfolk during the dark, or what dark pacts the elves made for their own survival. The history books, the human history books, are mute on the subject, save where their stories cross our own. Arkal, Argivian scholar. On a lonely beach, the sun setting behind him, the ragman waited. The sand blew around his feet and caught in his tattered garments, forming fine traceries where the dark bandages met. Occasionally, a good burst of wind would send a spinning sand dervish along the length of the beach, shoving grit into the ragman's face. If the being had eyes in the conventional sense, he would have been blinded, but instead he stood there, waiting. The tide was coming in, each wave traveling slightly, farther up the wide, tilted expanse of the beach. In another hour, the ragman would be forced to retreat up the beach, taking his package with him. That would be in another hour. For the moment, the ragman stood on the beach, watching the fiddler crab move from hole to hole. Watching as the waves exposed the sand fleas, that would then burrow again in the loose muck, only to be exposed again by the next wave. Waiting. Shadows appeared in the water, no more than the heads and shoulders of creatures coming out of the sea. 1, 2, 4, then 7. Their skin was a dusky blue, and they wore their long hair like lions' manes. They moved toward the shore, toward the ragman. The ragman waited, giving no sign of noticing them. The merfolk reached the breakers now, and as the storm-swollen waves crested, they slid into the beach, letting the waves carry their streamlined bodies. 6 of them remained where the waves crashed and hissed up the beach. One of them, the leader, raised herself in the thin tidal waters and half crawled, half slithered forward. The merfolk leader curled up on her piscine hindquarters and hauled herself to her full height, still shorter than the ragman. The mare creature said something in a garbled, throaty language. The ragman nodded. The merfolk leader said something else, more emphatically. The ragman nodded again. The merfolk leader motioned with her arm, and 2 more of her people splashed ashore, carrying a bundle between them. The bundle was wrapped in a net made of cord woven from kelp. The commanding merfolk gargled something else, and the 2 bearers unwrapped the net to reveal a young man, his face pale and his skin slightly bluish. The young man did not move. He had a gag made of seaweed fronds clamped across his mouth. The merfolk leader looked at the ragman. The ragman merely nodded. The merfolk leader gargled something else. One of the other merfolk pulled at the frond over the young man's mouth. It came away easily. The young man still did not move, and his chest was still. The merfolk leader struck the prostrate body in the ribs. The young man coughed once, and water spilled out of his throat, then he inhaled, in a deep, ragged breath, coughed again and continued to breathe. His chest rose and fell normally now. The ragman nodded and reached for his satchel. The black-wrapped creature picked up the canvas bag and pulled from it a helmet. The helm was made entirely of orange coral and looked as if it had been grown into that shape instead of fashioned by human hands. He presented it to the merfolk leader. The merfolk leader baited her fangs and said something else in her garbled, throaty language. The ragman merely nodded. The 3 merfolk raiders half crawled, half slithered back to where the combers were breaking. Already the other merfolk were fleeing the shore. The 2 bearers followed, diving in without looking back. The leader looked back one last time, then dived in as well, following her brethren away from the beach. The ragman waited until all the merfolk had departed, the sky darkening behind him. Then the ragged creature picked up the young man and pulled him free of his kelp-woven net. He grasped the young man by the neck of his shirt and dragged him up above the high tide mark, where even the storm-swollen waves would not touch him, to a small divot between 2 dunes. Driftwood had already been stacked in a shallow pit, and dried salt grasses had been added as tinder. The ragman laid the young man's body out and touched the side of his cheek with the back of a skeletal hand. The young man's flesh was already warm, when moments before it had been as cold as ice. The ragman reached inside his robes, reached inside his chest. There was a cracking noise as the being snapped off part of his own rib cage. The man-like creature withdrew the bone and held it up in the moonless night. The ragged edge of the bone glowed of its own volition, a corpse light powered by undead wizardry. The ragman knelt down and used the sputtering corpse light to set fire to the driftwood. Their position between the dunes would keep the light from being seen from afar. The ragman checked the young man's body again. It was warmer still. He moved the lad slightly closer to the flames, not so close as to singe the clothing, but close enough to warm the young man. Having done so, the ragman watched the tableau he had created: the body, now breathing steadily, the fire in its pit, and himself, all set between the dunes in a moonless sky. The ragman nodded and walked 50 paces away. Then he stopped, turned, and faced the fire. And the ragman waited.